The synthetic rhythm of the fetal monitor was a metronome counting down the seconds to a detonation I couldn't yet comprehend. Each sharp electronic chirp sliced through the frigid, sterilized air of the VIP maternity suite at Cedars-Sinai. I lay tethered to a labyrinth of transparent tubing, my spine resting against the stiff, unforgiving mattress. The epidural had begun to wear off on the left side of my body, leaving a terrifying, jagged coastline of sensation where the numbness ended and the raw, tearing agony began. The scent of industrial bleach and iodine coated the back of my tongue, but beneath it, I could trace the distinct, heavy notes of sandalwood and bergamot, Mason's cologne. He was standing entirely too close to the railing of the bed. His right hand was locked around my left wrist. It wasn't a comforting hold. It was a tourniquet. His knuckles were bone white, the tendons in his forearm pulled taut beneath the rolled-up sleeve of his chambray shirt. I watched the frantic, erratic pulse fluttering in the hollow of his throat. He wasn't looking at my face. His hazel eyes were violently fixated on the digital numbers flashing across the monitor screen, reading the decelerations of the infant's heart rate with the breathless, terrifying intensity of a man watching his entire world hang in the balance. "The baseline is dropping again," Mason stated, his voice a low, gravelly scrape that barely breached the silence. He didn't address the room. He didn't address me. The words were a hyper-focused observation directed at the attending obstetrician, Dr. Aris, who was currently snapping a fresh pair of latex gloves over his wrists at the foot of my bed. "It's a temporary compression, Mason, Doctor," Aris replied, his tone smooth, practiced, deliberately devoid of urgency. "Harper is moving into the transitional phase of labor. The pressure on the cord causes brief decelerations. It is entirely within the normal parameters." I felt Mason's jaw clench. The muscles rippled just beneath his skin, a microscopic physical rebellion against the doctor's calm. His thumb pressed harder into the delicate bones of my wrist, grinding them together. I turned my head, the crisp hospital pillowcase catching on my sweat-drenched hair. Chloe stood 10 feet away, a ghost haunting her own supposed miracle. My sister had anchored herself to the window ledge overlooking the sprawling, smog-choked grid of Los Angeles. She wore a pristine cream-colored cashmere wrap over a silk camisole. Her blonde hair fell in immaculate, flawless waves over her shoulders. She looked dressed for a charity luncheon in Beverly Hills, completely incongruous with the visceral, bloody reality of a delivery room. She wasn't looking at the monitor. She wasn't looking at the bed. She was staring out at the crawling headlights on Beverly Boulevard. Her arms crossed so tightly over her chest that the fabric of her wrap strained against the sharp points of her shoulders. Her right heel, encased in a red-soled pump, tapped a silent, frantic rhythm against the linoleum floor. Tap, tap, tap. It was the physical manifestation of a tightly coiled spring, slowly being wound past its breaking point. "Julian," Chloe's voice cut through the room, sharp and brittle as cracked glass. "Check the email from the legal department again. They said the final post-birth custodial transfer documents would be heavily encrypted." Julian Sterling sat in the plush leather recliner in the corner of the suite. The ambient blue light from his iPad Pro washed over the sharp, aristocratic angles of his face. He didn't look up from the screen. He adjusted the platinum cuffs of his tailored dress shirt with his free hand, a gesture of absolute, chilling detachment. "The documents are in order, Chloe," Julian murmured, his baritone voice carrying the effortless authority of a man who billed thousands of dollars an hour to dismantle corporations. "The surrogacy contract is ironclad. The anonymous egg donor relinquished all genetic claims prior to the fertilization phase. My signature and my genetic contribution are the only variables dictating ownership of the asset. The transfer will be instantaneous upon birth." Asset. The word struck the center of my chest like a physical blow. I squeezed my eyes shut, a fresh, blinding wave of pain rolling through my lower abdomen, radiating outward to crush my hips in a vise of pure fire. I gasped, the sound ragged and pathetic, tearing through the plastic oxygen mask strapped over my nose and mouth. Mason instantly leaned over me, his chest pressing against the metal side rail. The scent of sandalwood became suffocating. I felt the erratic, shallow heat of his breath against my temple. "Breathe, Harper," he whispered, the sound vibrating with a frantic, localized panic that Julian and Chloe completely lacked. "Just breathe. I'm right here. I'm not leaving you. I'm not leaving him." I opened my eyes, fighting through the haze of agony to focus on my husband's face. Him. We didn't know the gender. Julian had explicitly demanded that the gender remain sealed in the medical files until the moment of birth. Chloe had claimed it was to preserve the magic of the surprise. Yet, Mason had just used a definitive pronoun. I searched his hazel eyes, looking for the warm, steady architect I had married 3 years ago. The man who spent his Sundays sketching mid-century modern blueprints on our kitchen island in Pasadena, sipping black coffee and listening to Coltrane. But the man hovering over me was a stranger. His pupils were dilated, swallowing the iris. A thin sheen of cold sweat coated his forehead. He looked entirely consumed, possessed by a primal, terrifying territorialism that defied all logic. Why was my husband vibrating with the protective instinct of a father, while the man who had supposedly provided the genetic material sat in the corner, checking his emails? Dr. Aris. Julian's voice suddenly shifted. The low, even baritone sharpened, losing its casual detachment. The tapping of Chloe's heel stopped instantly. The silence in the room solidified, becoming a heavy physical weight. Julian slowly lowered the iPad, resting it on his knee. He looked up, his pale gray eyes fixing directly on the back of the obstetrician's neck. I am reviewing the secondary addendums sent by the clinic's archival server, Julian stated, the words measured, clipped, and deeply dangerous. There is a document buried in the final subfolder, a Form 8B, a directed donor acknowledgement. Dr. Aris froze. His hands, still encased in the sterile latex gloves, hovered perfectly still over the stainless steel instrument tray. He didn't turn around. The silence stretched, tight as a garrote wire. Julian, put the tablet away, Chloe said. Her voice was too high. The brittle edge was gone, replaced by a sudden, hollow panic. She turned away from the window, taking a single step toward the center of the room. Her hands fell to her sides, her fingers curling slightly. This is not the time to review paperwork. Harper is in active labor. Julian didn't look at his wife. He kept his eyes locked on the paralyzed doctor. Form 8B is utilized when biological material is sourced from a known third party, overriding the anonymous donor protocols. Julian continued, reading the invisible text in the air between him and the doctor. My genetic sample was deposited 6 months prior to the transfer, utilizing a standard freeze-thaw protocol due to my travel schedule in London. I was assured the viability was exceptional. I felt Mason's grip on my wrist shift. It wasn't a tightening. It was a complete, structural locking of his joints. The bones in his hand felt like cold steel. He slowly straightened his spine, pulling away from the bed rail, putting his body between me and the rest of the room. Another contraction ripped through me, utterly catastrophic in its violence. The pain was blinding, white-hot, entirely consuming my ability to breathe. I screamed, the sound muffled by the plastic mask, my fingernails digging into the thin mattress cover. She is completely effaced. Dr. Aris announced abruptly, his voice a full octave higher than it had been 2 minutes ago. He practically lunged toward the foot of the bed, desperate to change the trajectory of the room. Harper, I need you to bear down on the next wave. We are ready. Dr. Aris. Julian stood up. The leather recliner creaked in protest. He dropped the iPad onto the side table. The soft thud sounded like a gavel falling. You will answer my question before a single procedure continues in this room. Whose genetic material was utilized in the fertilization of the donor egg? Julian, stop it! Chloe shrieked, the pristine facade entirely shattering. She rushed forward, grabbing her husband's forearm. Her perfectly manicured nails dug into the expensive wool of his suit jacket. You are ruining this. This is supposed to be my moment. Stop looking at the files. Julian looked down at his wife's hand, then slowly brought his gaze up to her face. The gray of his eyes was absolute, freezing zero. He didn't pull his arm away. He simply stared at her with a look of pure, analytical revulsion. You knew, Julian whispered. It wasn't a question. The monitor beside my bed began to scream. A rapid, high-pitched alarm indicating the fetal heart rate was dropping into a critical danger zone. The stress in the room, the adrenaline flooding my bloodstream, was suffocating the child inside me. The heart rate is at 90, Mason roared, the sound tearing out of his throat, raw and violent. He completely ignored Julian and Chloe. He leaned over the bed, his face inches from mine. Push, Harper, push right now. You have to get him out. I didn't have a choice. My body took over, a primal, uncontrollable mechanism overriding my conscious thought. I squeezed my eyes shut, tucked my chin to my chest, and pushed with a force that felt like my pelvis was splintering into 1,000 jagged pieces. The pressure was immense, a burning ring of fire that blocked out the sound of Julian's voice, Chloe's sobbing, and the frantic beeping of the machinery. "Good, Harper, keep going, 10 seconds. Doctor," Eris shouted, the professional calm entirely abandoning him. I pushed until the blood vessels in my eyes threatened to burst, until the roaring in my ears drowned out the entire universe. And then, a sudden, wet release. The crushing pressure vanished in an instant, leaving behind a hollow, agonizing emptiness. I collapsed back against the pillows, gasping, my lungs burning as I sucked the sterile air through the mask. The silence in the room returned, profound and terrifying. It lasted for exactly 3 seconds. Then, a thin, sharp wail shattered the quiet. A furious, wet cry of a newborn protesting the cold air of the world. "Time of birth, 11:42 p.m., Dr. Eris said, his voice trembling slightly. He held the screaming infant, quickly wiping the fluid from its face with a sterile towel. I expected the doctor to bring the baby to my chest. I expected Chloe to rush forward, to claim the prize she had paid millions of dollars to secure. But nobody moved. Through the haze of exhaustion and pain, I forced my eyes open. Dr. Eris stood at the foot of the bed, holding the infant. The baby was crying, its small fists curled tightly against its chest. The top of the baby's head was covered in a thick, distinct layer of dark auburn hair. Julian Sterling, whose hair was a striking, icy blonde, stared at the auburn hair. Chloe Sterling, whose hair was an equally flawless blonde, covered her mouth with both hands, tears streaming down her face, backing away from the bed as if the child were a live grenade. I slowly turned my head to my left. Mason was staring at the infant. The auburn hair on his own head caught the harsh fluorescent light of the delivery suite. The mask he had worn for 3 years, the mask of the supportive husband, the dutiful brother-in-law, the quiet architect, dissolved completely, revealing the terrifying truth underneath. He didn't look at me. He didn't look at Julian. Mason took a slow, deliberate step toward the foot of the bed. "Mason," Julian said, his voice a low, lethal whisper. "Step back." Mason ignored him. He reached out, his hands trembling with an adrenaline-fueled reverence. He didn't ask for permission. He simply took the screaming infant from Dr. Eris's frozen grip. Mason pulled the baby against his chest, burying his face into the damp auburn hair. He closed his eyes, a ragged sob tearing through his chest, a sound of absolute possessive triumph. "I've got you," Mason whispered to the child, the words carrying perfectly through the silent room. "Daddy's got you." The sterile air of the delivery room turned entirely to ash. The word hung suspended in the sterile air. A heavy, jagged stone dropped into a glass pool. "Daddy." The oxygen in the room seemed to combust, leaving behind a suffocating vacuum. The infant's wails vibrated against the plastic casing of the oxygen mask strapped to my face. The sharp, metallic tang of my own blood filled my nasal cavity, mixing with the sickeningly sweet scent of the medical-grade adhesive pulling at the skin of my inner thigh. Julian Sterling did not shout. Men who commanded skyscrapers and dismantled global conglomerates with the stroke of a fountain pen did not engage in theatrical outbursts. The transition was microscopic, yet infinitely more terrifying than a scream. The faint, aristocratic lines around his mouth hardened into deep white trenches. He reached up, his thumb and index finger catching the knot of his silk Tom Ford tie, pulling it down exactly half an inch. The precise, measured loosening of the collar was a structural realignment. He was preparing for a demolition. Julian bypassed Chloe completely. He didn't even glance at his wife, whose manicured hands were still clamped over her mouth, her eyes wide and reflecting the harsh fluorescent glare of the surgical lights. He walked toward the foot of the bed, his Italian leather Oxfords entirely silent on the linoleum. He stopped 2 feet from Mason. "Place the infant in the warming bassinet," Julian instructed. The baritone was a flat, dead frequency. It contained no anger, no panic, only the absolute crushing weight of a legal directive. Mason's shoulders hitched. The chambray fabric of his shirt stretched across his back, the fibers groaning under the sudden, violent tension. He was cradling the screaming child tight against his collarbone, his large, architect's hands I had watched meticulously draft mid-century elevations on our kitchen island, now wrapped protectively around a fragile, bloody spine. He didn't turn around. He simply lowered his chin, resting his jaw against the crown of the baby's auburn head. "He's cold," Mason murmured, the gravel in his voice thick with a feral, possessive resonance. "He needs skin to skin. He needs an APGAR assessment," Dr. Eris interjected, his voice trembling so violently it cracked on the second syllable. The obstetrician was pressed against the stainless steel cabinetry, his gloved hands raised in a gesture of pathetic surrender. "Mason, please. The protocol." "Fuck your protocol, Elias," Mason snapped, turning his head just enough to fix the doctor with a single, unblinking glare. The use of the doctor's first name hit the room like a physical strike. It wasn't the respectful deference of a supporting family member. It was the sharp reprimand of a co-conspirator. My lungs seized. The monitor beside my head let out a frantic, rapid sequence of beeps, registering the sudden, catastrophic spike in my blood pressure. Elias. Mason knew his first name. They didn't meet at the formal consultations. Mason had always sat in the waiting room of the Beverly Hills Clinic, reading architectural digests, playing the role of the dutiful, entirely uninvolved husband. Julian slowly slid his hands into the pockets of his tailored trousers. He tilted his head, observing Mason with the cold, detached fascination of an entomologist studying a particularly repulsive insect. The transfer of biological property is dictated by the terms outlined in Section 4, Paragraph B, of the Gestational Surrogacy Agreement, Julian recited, the legal terminology slicing through the wet cries of the newborn. "I am the sole contractual father. You are currently holding an asset that belongs to the Sterling Trust. If you do not place the asset in the bassinet within the next 5 seconds, I will have the hospital's private security detail fracture your jaw and remove it from your hands." The word echoed in my skull again. Asset. I tried to push myself up on my elbows, a desperate, instinctual need to place myself between my husband and the child he was holding. But the epidural was only half gone. The lower quadrant of my body was a dead, heavy block of concrete, while the upper half burned with the white-hot tearing of internal stitches. My elbow buckled, and I collapsed back onto the sweat-soaked pillow, a ragged, pathetic moan escaping the oxygen mask. Mason finally turned to look at Julian. The hazel eyes that had looked at me with such fabricated warmth for 3 years were entirely vacant. The blueprint of our marriage had been a facade, a hollow structure built over a sinkhole, and I was finally seeing the foundation collapse. "You can call security, Julian," Mason said quietly, rocking back on his heels, a terrifying smirk playing at the corner of his mouth. "You can call the LAPD. You can call your army of corporate litigators. But before you do, I suggest you take a very close look at the 8B acknowledgement form your wife forged." Chloe let out a sharp, strangled gasp. Her knees buckled slightly, the red-soled pumps skidding against the floor. She caught herself against the window ledge, her knuckles turning bone white as she gripped the aluminum framing. Julian didn't look at her. He didn't break eye contact with Mason. A forgery invalidates the clause. It does not transfer ownership to the donor. It simply constitutes fraud. It's not just fraud if the intended father's biological sample was clinically dead upon arrival, Mason countered, his voice dropping into a smooth, devastating rhythm. He was laying out a floor plan, brick by brick, zero motility, a complete structural failure. The clinic was going to cancel the cycle. Your wife was going to fail you, again. Julian's jaw tightened. A single, microscopic twitch of the muscle beneath his left ear. It was the only physical indicator that Mason's words had landed. "So," Mason continued, stepping closer to the warming bassinet, but not relinquishing his hold on the child. "She needed a donor, but not just any donor. She needed someone who wouldn't be flagged by your obsessive background checks, someone who shared enough genetic overlap with the maternal line to explain away any slight phenotypic deviations, if they arose, someone who was already standing in the shadows." I stopped trying to breathe. The mechanical hiss of the oxygen flowing into my mask was the only sound in my universe. The puzzle pieces, jagged and rusted, were violently locking into place, tearing through my sanity. 6 months ago, the anniversary dinner at a private omakase counter in West Hollywood, I had excused myself to the restroom. When I returned, the heavy velvet curtain separating our booth from the main dining room was drawn tight. I had paused, my hand hovering over the fabric. I heard Chloe's voice, A frantic, hushed whisper. He's going to leave me, Mason. The prenup leaves me with nothing if I don't produce an heir. You have to do this. And Mason's reply, low and steady, vibrating with an undercurrent of something dark and transactional. I'll give you the sample, Chloe, but you know my price. You know exactly what I want in return. I had convinced myself they were talking about a loan, a business investment, the willful ignorance of a woman desperately trying to keep the load-bearing walls of her life intact. You utilized my wife's body as an incubator for your own genetic ambition, Julian stated. The observation was devoid of outrage. It was pure, icy arithmetic. I utilized an available resource to secure a legacy, Mason corrected, slowly lowering his arms, finally placing the exhausted, sniffling infant onto the sterile mattress of the bassinet. He kept one hand resting protectively over the baby's chest. I couldn't give Harper the life she deserved on an architect's salary. A house in Pasadena? A mid-range Volvo? That's not a legacy, Julian. That's a slow march to mediocrity. This child inherits the sterling empire. And as his biological father, so do I. The sheer blinding sociopathy of the statement paralyzed me. He hadn't just cheated on me. He hadn't just orchestrated a medical fraud. He had looked at my body, my womb, my blood, my pain, and calculated it as square footage to be developed for his own profit. Doctor. Aris lunged forward, the second Mason's hand moved away from the bassinet. The doctor was sweating profusely, his face the color of spoiled milk. He began rapidly clamping and wiping the infant, desperate to perform the medical duties that would somehow anchor him back to the reality of his profession and away from the felony conspiracy unraveling in his suite. Julian turned away from Mason. The shift in his posture was absolute. He dismissed the architect as a solved equation. He walked slowly toward the window, stopping 3 feet from where his wife was trembling against the glass. Chloe couldn't look at him. Her chin was buried in the collar of her cashmere wrap, her eyes squeezed shut, thick black tears of ruined mascara tracking down her pale cheeks. Julian, please, she choked out, the words barely audible over the hum of the HVAC system. I was terrified. The doctors said the testosterone therapy you did in your 20s, the damage was irreversible. You said if this surrogate failed, we were done. You said you wouldn't fund another cycle. I couldn't lose you. You did not fear losing me, Chloe. Julian corrected, his voice a soft, lethal caress. You feared losing the black card. You feared losing the estate in Aspen and the gallery directorship. He reached out. His movement was so slow, so deliberate, it felt hypnotic. He placed his index finger under Chloe's chin, forcing her head up until her tear-streaked face was illuminated by the harsh overhead lights. You contaminated my lineage, Julian whispered, the words slipping out like a razor blade hidden in an apple. You brought the genetics of a middle-class draftsman into my house and attempted to pass it off as my own. The sheer, staggering audacity of your stupidity is almost impressive. It's a sterling on paper, Chloe pleaded, her hands coming up to grasp at Julian's wrist, her perfectly manicured nails scraping against his platinum cufflink. No one has to know. Mason signed an NDA. We paid him. We. She stopped, her breath catching in her throat as she realized what she had just confessed in front of a room full of medical staff and her hemorrhaging sister. My vision tunneled, the edges bleeding into a dark, pulsing static. We paid him. Mason hadn't just negotiated a biological tie. He had taken a cash payout. The sudden influx of capital, he claimed, came from a freelance commercial commission 3 months ago. The down payment on the modern glass house in the Hollywood Hills he had been obsessively drafting. It was blood money. It was the rental fee for my uterus. Julian slowly extracted his wrist from Chloe's grasp, peeling her fingers back one by one with methodical disgust. He pulled a silk pocket square from his jacket and wiped his hands, as if she had transferred a pathogen to his skin. You will return to the Bel Air estate, Julian instructed his wife, his gaze fixed on the smoggy Los Angeles skyline. You will pack 2 suitcases. You will not touch the art, the jewelry in the main safe, or the bearer bonds. My driver will take you to your mother's condominium in Santa Monica. If you attempt to access the joint accounts, I will have the FBI freeze them under suspicion of medical wire fraud. Chloe collapsed. Her knees simply gave out, and she hit the linoleum floor with a heavy, ungraceful thud, the cashmere wrap pooling around her like a discarded shroud. She didn't scream. She just curled into a tight, shivering ball, a spectacular, immediate ruin. "Julian, you can't." "Doctor," Eris started, turning from the bassinet, holding a small syringe of vitamin K. Julian snapped his head toward the doctor, the icy gray eyes locking onto the trembling man. "Elias, you will finish your medical duties regarding the surrogate. You will stabilize her. Then, you will walk out of this hospital. You will go to your office, and you will begin shredding every piece of documentation that connects my name to this catastrophic failure. If I see your face in this city after tomorrow, I will ensure the medical board revokes your license for illegal genetic trafficking before I file the civil suit that will bankrupt your grandchildren." The silence in the room was absolute, save for the rhythmic, exhausted panting of the newborn. Julian turned on his heel. He didn't look at the baby in the bassinet. He didn't look at Mason, who was watching him with a tight, calculating sneer. And he didn't look at me, lying in a pool of my own fluids, the collateral damage of their war. The heavy oak door of the delivery suite clicked shut behind him. The immediate aftermath of a detonation is never loud. It is characterized by a ringing, suffocating deafness. Two nurses hurried into the room, their eyes wide, their postures rigid with the unspoken command to ignore the shattered socialite on the floor and the venomous tension radiating from the architect standing by the bassinet. They moved with mechanical efficiency, transferring me from the blood-soaked delivery bed to a narrow, wheeled gurney. I felt the distinct, sharp tug of the internal stitches, a searing reminder of the physical extraction. I stared at the acoustic tiles of the ceiling as the gurney was pushed out of the suite, the fluorescent lights strobing overhead in a sickening, rhythmic flash. Flash, dark, flash, dark. The rhythm mimicked the fracturing of my own timeline. The life I had lived at 10 p.m. no longer existed at midnight. The postpartum recovery room in the private wing was a masterclass in suffocating luxury. Heavy velvet drapes blocked out the city lights. The walls were painted a soft, muted sage. A massive, flat-screen television was recessed into the wall, a black, glossy void reflecting the empty room. The nurses transferred me to the bed, adjusted the IV line dripping Pitocin to contract my uterus, and quietly slipped out, closing the heavy door with a soft, final click. I was alone. The numbness in my left leg was slowly receding, replaced by a deep, throbbing ache that radiated from my pelvis down to my knees. The physical pain was a necessary anchor. It kept me tethered to the mattress, preventing my mind from completely untethering and floating into the absolute, pitch-black void of psychosis. I focused on the steady drip of the IV chamber. Drop, drop, drop. The door handle turned. A slow, agonizingly deliberate twist. Mason stepped into the room. He had taken the time to wash his hands. The sleeves of his chambray shirt were rolled down and buttoned at the wrists, hiding the veins that had been bulging in the delivery room. He closed the door behind him and leaned against the wood, crossing his ankles. The harsh, fluorescent lighting of the hallway was gone, replaced by the warm, amber glow of the bedside lamp, casting long, deceptive shadows across the angles of his face. He looked exactly like the man I had married. The illusion was flawless, and it made me want to vomit. "The pediatric team took him to the NICU for observation," Mason said, his voice dropping an octave, slipping back into the smooth, comforting cadence he used when I was stressed about a design deadline. "Just a precaution. His APGAR was an 8. He's perfect, Harper." I didn't turn my head. I kept my eyes locked on the plastic IV chamber. The silence stretched, a heavy, suffocating blanket thrown over the room. Mason pushed off the door and walked slowly toward the bed. I heard the soft squeak of his rubber-soled shoes against the polished floorboards. He stopped at the edge of the mattress, near my knees. He reached out, his hand hovering over the blanket, before gently resting his palm against my shin. The heat of his touch bled through the thin cotton. A violent shudder ripped through my entire body, a primal neurological rejection of the contact. I ripped my leg away from his hand, the sudden movement tearing a sharp gasp of pain from my throat as the fresh stitches pulled taut. "Don't," I choked out. The word tasted like copper and ash. Mason's hand remained suspended in the empty air for a fraction of a second before he slowly curled his fingers into a loose fist and lowered it to his side. He didn't look offended. He looked patient. The terrifying patience of a predator waiting for the prey to exhaust itself against the bars of the cage. I know you're in shock, Harp, Mason murmured, pulling a heavy velvet armchair closer to the bed and sitting down. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, clasping his hands together. The delivery was traumatic. Julian's reaction was entirely unhinged. But we need to look at the geometry of the situation. We need to look at the structural integrity of what we have now. Geometry. Structural integrity. He was speaking to me in blueprints, trying to draft a logical schematic for the absolute annihilation of my soul. You sold me. The sentence didn't sound like a question. It was a flat, dead statement of fact, echoing in the quiet room. Mason sighed, a heavy, theatrical sound of exhaustion. He ran a hand through his auburn hair. I didn't sell you, Harper. I capitalized on an inevitable failure. Chloe came to me in tears. Julian's sample was necrotic. The clinic gave them a 0% probability of fertilization, even with ICSI. Julian was going to pull the funding for the entire surrogacy. He was going to leave her. So you gave her your sperm, I whispered, finally turning my head to look at him. The amber light caught the flecks of green in his hazel eyes, making them look reptilian. You created a child with my sister, and you let me carry it. It was a donor egg, Harper, Mason stated, his voice firm, projecting an aura of absolute reason. Chloe's ovaries were hyperstimulated into oblivion 3 years ago. The egg was an anonymous premium donor from the clinic's database. My genetics, a blank slate's genetics, and your body to incubate it. You were already prepped for the cycle, the hormones, the mock transfers. You were ready. If I hadn't stepped in, Julian would have canceled the contract. We would have lost the surrogate fee. The fee, I repeated, the words souring in my mouth. The $200,000 Chloe paid me to carry her miracle. That wasn't enough for you? $200,000 is a down payment on a decent life, Harp. It's not a legacy. Mason leaned closer, his eyes burning with a dark, terrifying intensity. Chloe was desperate. She offered me the Hollywood Hills house down payment to sign the 8B form, but I knew the real value wasn't in the cash. The real value is the child. Julian Sterling has no other heirs. His entire trust, the billions locked in the Vance holding accounts, requires a biological successor. On paper, Julian is the father, but I have the DNA proof. I hold the override switch to the entire Sterling empire. I stared at him, my mind desperately trying to find the man who used to leave sticky notes with little architectural sketches on the bathroom mirror. He was gone. He had never existed. The man sitting in the velvet chair was a parasite, a flawless mimic who had studied my vulnerabilities and used them to anchor himself to a billionaire's bank account. Julian knows, I said, my voice trembling, not from fear, but from the sheer, freezing cold radiating from the center of my chest. He looked at the baby, Mason. He saw your hair. He looked at the files. He threw Chloe out. He's going to destroy the contract. He's not going to claim a child that belongs to you. Mason smiled. It wasn't a warm expression. It was the sharp, jagged grin of a man who had already calculated the load-bearing capacity of his enemy's pride. Julian is a narcissist, Harper. His entire public persona is built on the illusion of absolute control and flawless genetics, Mason said softly, leaning back in the chair. If he disavows the child, the board of directors will demand to know why. The medical fraud will become public record. His wife's embezzlement to pay me off will be front-page news in the Wall Street Journal. The Sterling name will be a punchline. He paused, letting the silence stretch, allowing the sheer weight of the blackmail to settle into the room. Julian won't destroy the contract, Mason continued, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. He will adopt the child quietly to save face. He will banish Chloe to maintain the illusion of a clean divorce. And I will remain in the periphery. The tragic, supportive uncle. But Julian will know that at any moment, a single DNA swab could unravel his entire empire. He will fund the trust. He will fund my firm. He will pay the extortion for the rest of his natural life to keep his legacy intact. The architecture of his plan was sickeningly perfect. He hadn't just built a house. He had built a prison, and he had used my body as the foundation. And me? I asked, the words barely pushing past my lips. Where do I fit into this floor plan, Mason? The surrogate who birthed her husband's bastard child? The woman who just watched her sister get thrown to the wolves? Mason's expression softened. The predatory gleam vanished, replaced by a terrifying synthetic empathy. He reached out again, and this time, I was too exhausted, too broken to pull away. His fingers wrapped around my wrist, his thumb gently stroking the blue vein pulsing beneath my skin. "You are my wife, Harper," he said, the earnestness in his tone making my stomach heave. "We go back to Pasadena, we take the surrogate fee, we take the quiet payouts Julian will inevitably send to keep us compliant, and we build our life. You can open your own interior design studio. We can try for our own baby, the real way." This was just business. High-stakes architecture. You don't have to carry the weight of it. I looked down at his hand gripping my wrist, the hand that had held a newborn child 20 minutes ago, and claimed it as a piece of leveraged real estate. My mind dragged me backward, violently pulling me into the undertow of the past 9 months. The endless appointments at the Beverly Hills clinic, the hormone injections that made my joints ache and my vision blur, the absolute, unwavering control Dr. Aris exercised over every single aspect of my biology. You were already prepped for the cycle, the hormones, the mock transfers. You were ready. A cold, paralyzing dread began to seep into the base of my skull. It started as a whisper, a microscopic crack in the drywall of Mason's perfect narrative. I remembered the week before the embryo transfer. I had experienced severe, crippling pelvic pain. Mason had rushed me to the clinic. Dr. Aris had performed a transvaginal ultrasound, his face entirely unreadable. "It's a minor ovarian cyst, Harper. Extremely common with the PrEP hormones. We need to do a quick aspiration procedure to ensure the uterine lining isn't compromised before the transfer. You'll be under light twilight sedation." I had woken up in the recovery bay, groggy and aching, with Mason holding my hand, telling me everything went perfectly. But surrogates don't get ovarian cysts that require emergency aspiration. Women undergoing active egg retrieval cycles do. "The donor," I whispered, the words slipping out of my mouth before my conscious mind could fully process the terror behind them. Mason's thumb stopped stroking my wrist. The rhythmic, soothing motion froze instantly. "What about the donor?" he asked. The synthetic warmth in his voice didn't waver, but the muscles in his forearm locked tight. I slowly raised my eyes, tracing the line of his arm up to his shoulder, to his neck, finally locking onto his hazel eyes. The pupils were dilated again, a sudden sharp spike of adrenaline overriding his calculated calm. "You said Chloe's ovaries were hyperstimulated," I said, my voice gaining a strange, hollow resonance in the quiet room. "You said the egg was from an anonymous premium donor, a blank slate." "It was," Mason replied smoothly, entirely too quickly. "A graduate student from UCLA, flawless medical history. We reviewed the file together, remember? We reviewed a printed piece of paper with redacted names," I countered, the memory sharpening into agonizing focus. "A piece of paper Dr. Aris handed us in his office. The same Dr. Aris who you called by his first name. The same Dr. Aris who took a bribe from my sister to falsify the 8B form." Mason slowly withdrew his hand from my wrist. He leaned back in the velvet chair, his posture rigid. The architect, realizing a load-bearing column, was suddenly shifting off its axis. "Harper, you're exhausted. The epidural is messing with your cognitive function," he started, the gaslighting reflexive and smooth. "I had an aspiration procedure 4 days before the transfer." I cut him off, the realization hitting me with the force of a physical blow to the sternum. "Dr. Aris said it was a cyst. But you don't aspirate a cyst to prep a uterus. You aspirate follicles. You retrieve eggs." The silence in the room became absolute. The rhythmic drip of the IV seemed to amplify, echoing like a hammer striking an anvil. Mason didn't blink. He didn't deny it. He simply stared at me, the mask entirely disintegrating, revealing the cold, calculating void underneath. My breathing became erratic, shallow gasps of air that failed to reach my lungs. The room began to spin, the sage-green walls closing in around the bed. Why pay an anonymous donor $50,000 when the surrogate is already pumped full of the necessary hormones? I asked, the words tumbling out in a frantic, horrified rush. Why introduce an unknown genetic variable when you have a perfectly healthy, genetically sound woman already strapped to the examination table? I dragged my gaze down to my own abdomen, the deflated, agonizing ruin of my body. "You didn't just give Chloe your sperm," I choked out, the tears finally breaking, hot and blinding, tracking down my temples into my hair. You couldn't afford the premium donor egg, so you let Dr. Eris steal mine. Mason stood up. The movement was sharp, aggressive. He didn't reach for my hand this time. He stepped back from the bed, his face hardening into a mask of pure, unapologetic ambition. You wanted a family, Harper, Mason said, his voice entirely devoid of the man I had married, a cold, metallic frequency that belonged to a stranger. You wanted a child. I gave you one. He just happens to come with $1 billion trust fund. The monitor beside my bed began to scream again, a high, piercing alarm registering the absolute, catastrophic collapse of my heart rate as the final, horrifying truth settled into my bones. The child wasn't a donor's. He wasn't Chloe's. He was mine. And the man standing at the foot of my bed had stolen him from my own body to sell him to a billionaire. The mechanical shriek of the heart monitor did not summon a frantic rush of medical personnel. We were sealed inside the Platinum Tier Recovery Suite at Cedars-Sinai, a reinforced, soundproof vault designed explicitly to keep the messy, visceral realities of biology from disturbing the high-net-worth individuals occupying the adjacent wings. The alarm was a localized, deafening scream, vibrating against the acoustic ceiling tiles, demanding a rescue that was not coming. Mason didn't flinch. He didn't shout for a nurse. He didn't reach for my hand to anchor me to reality. He slowly extended his right index finger and pressed the heavy yellow override button on the console. The room plunged back into an agonizing, suffocating silence, broken only by the ragged, wet sound of my own hyperventilation. You need to regulate your respiratory rate, Harper, Mason stated. His voice was a flat, synthesized frequency, completely divorced from the man I thought I knew. He casually checked the face of his matte black Breitling watch, the smooth sweep of the second hand holding more of his attention than my collapsing vitals. Spiking your cortisol levels will only force the attending staff to push a chemical sedative into your line. We cannot afford for you to be unconscious. We have strategic decisions to make before Julian's legal team files the preliminary injunctions at dawn. I stared at the pristine line of his jaw, the faint shadow of stubble catching the amber light of the bedside lamp. My mind was violently attempting to reconcile the monster standing at the foot of my bed with the man who used to trace the line of my spine while I slept. A memory, sharp and uninvited, clawed its way to the surface of my fracturing psyche. 2 years ago, we were standing in the gutted shell of a mid-century remodel in the Hollywood Hills. Mason had been hired as the lead architect. I had driven up to bring him lunch. He was standing in the sunken living room, staring at a massive, exposed load-bearing beam. He held a moisture meter in his hand. The reading was in the deep red. Dry rot had entirely consumed the core of the timber. I had asked him if he was going to call the structural engineer to halt the project. Mason had simply wiped the dust from his expensive boots, looked at the contractor, and quietly instructed him to wrap the rotting beam in high-grade steel brackets and cover it with decorative mahogany paneling. The client is liquidating their assets to fund this build, Harper, he had whispered to me in the car on the way home, his hand resting warmly on my thigh. If I halt production to replace the core structure, they go bankrupt and I lose my commission. We secure the exterior. What they don't see can't collapse on us. He had built our entire marriage on a rotted beam, and he had just wrapped my stolen child in decorative mahogany, entirely indifferent to the catastrophic collapse he had engineered inside my body. You're a sociopath, I breathed, the words scraping against my dry throat like crushed glass. Mason's eyes flicked from his watch to my face. The hazel irises were devoid of any heat. There was no anger, no defensiveness, only the mild, detached irritation of an engineer forced to explain a complex schematic to a layman. I am a pragmatist, Mason corrected, slowly sliding his hands into the pockets of his tailored trousers. Sociopathy implies a lack of underlying logic. Everything I have done possesses a flawless, structural logic. Chloe required a child to maintain her proximity to capital. Julian required a biological heir to satisfy his monumental ego. I required the capital to secure my own legacy. And you, Harper, he paused, his gaze dropping to the blood-stained sheets pooled around my waist. You required a purpose that your little freelance design firm could never fulfill. You wanted to be a mother. I merely bypassed the waiting period. The heavy oak door of the suite clicked open before I could find the breath to scream. 2 nurses stepped into the room, their rubber-soled shoes squeaking softly against the linoleum. Their expressions were carefully neutral, professional masks bolted firmly into place to ignore the suffocating tension radiating from the bed. The taller nurse, a woman with tight braids and tired eyes, immediately zeroed in on the monitor I was connected to. "Her blood pressure is dangerously elevated," the nurse noted, her hands moving swiftly over the IV console, tapping the digital screen. "She didn't look at Mason. She didn't look at me. She treated me as a failing machine that required recalibration. She's experiencing a severe panic response," Mason offered smoothly, stepping back from the bed to give them space. His voice dropped back into the sickeningly perfect cadence of the worried, exhausted husband. He ran a hand through his auburn hair, creating a calculated mess of the strands. The delivery was incredibly traumatic. The argument with her brother-in-law. It pushed her over the edge. She needs to rest. "We're going to administer a low dose of lorazepam through the line, Mr. Davis," the second nurse said, unsealing a sterile plastic syringe with a sharp crack. "It will lower her heart rate and allow her to sleep. The Pitocin is still contracting the uterus, so she needs to remain completely still to prevent further hemorrhaging." "No," I choked out, desperately trying to pull my left arm away from the IV pole. The movement sent a blinding spike of agony shooting through my pelvis, pinning me to the mattress. "No, don't sedate me. I need to see my baby. I need to see him." Mason moved to the opposite side of the bed, leaning over the rail. He gently placed his large, warm hand over my trembling fingers. The physical contact made my stomach violently heave. "Shh, Harp," Mason murmured, his thumb stroking my knuckles in front of the nurses. To them, it looked like a desperate act of comfort. To me, it was a heavy, suffocating chain locking me into the dark. "The baby is in the NICU. He's safe. You can't walk right now. You're bleeding too heavily. Let them help you sleep. I'll stay right here. I'll handle Julian. I'll handle everything." I looked into his eyes, watching the absolute terrifying confidence shining in the hazel depths. He wanted me unconscious. He needed me sedated so he could leave this room, walk into the corridors of power in this hospital, and finalize the extortion of a billionaire without the hysterical, inconvenient mother of his leverage getting in the way. The nurse depressed the plunger. The cold line of the chemical pushed its way up the vein in my forearm. It didn't burn. It was an insidious, heavy freeze that instantly began wrapping thick layers of wool around my cognitive function. The edges of the room began to blur. The sharp, terrifying reality of the stolen egg, the forged documents, the blackmail, it all began to sink beneath a dark, heavy tide. I fought it. I dug my fingernails into the palm of my own hand, trying to use the physical pain to tether my consciousness to the sterile ceiling tiles. I kept my eyes locked on Mason's face, forcing myself to memorize the exact angle of his jaw, the precise shade of his eyes, mapping the terrain of my enemy before the darkness consumed me completely. His image was the last thing to fade. The architect, standing triumphant over the ruins of the foundation he had just imploded. I didn't dream. There was no subconscious processing of the trauma, just a heavy, dreamless void that felt indistinguishable from death. When the chemical tide finally began to recede, it didn't leave clarity in its wake. It left a crushing, localized agony that demanded all of my processing power. The room was submerged in absolute darkness. The amber bedside lamp had been turned off. The only light was the faint, sickly green glow of the vital monitors and the thin sliver of ambient hallway light bleeding beneath the heavy oak door. I was alone. The velvet armchair where Mason had been sitting was empty. The air in the room was stale, the smell of iodine and sweat settling heavily into the fabric of the bedding. I slowly turned my head. My throat felt like it was coated in sand. I didn't press the call button pinned to the pillowcase. I couldn't risk the nurses returning. I couldn't risk them seeing my eyes open and pushing another dose of the sedative into my line. I needed to move. I needed to find the NICU. I pushed the heavy cotton blanket off my chest. The air conditioning of the VIP wing hit my damp skin, sending violent shivers down my spine. I looked at the IV line taped securely to the back of my hand. The clear plastic tubing was a leash, keeping me anchored to the bed. I didn't hesitate. I didn't think about the protocol or the potential for infection. I grabbed the hard plastic hub of the catheter, clamped my jaw shut to trap the scream in my throat, and ripped the needle out of my vein in one violent, upward motion. A hot, dark bead of blood instantly welled up on my skin, dripping rapidly onto the white sheets. I pressed my thumb hard against the puncture wound, holding the pressure until the metallic throbbing began to subside. The next step was a negotiation with gravity. The epidural had entirely worn off, leaving my lower half screaming with the raw, torn reality of a rapid, traumatic birth. The internal stitches burned with every microscopic shift of my muscles. The heavy, absorbent hospital pad between my legs was damp and uncomfortable, a constant reminder of the hemorrhage they were trying to control. I swung my legs over the side of the mattress. The moment my bare feet touched the freezing linoleum floor, a wave of nausea so profound it blurred my vision washed over me. The room tilted dangerously. I gripped the metal side rail of the bed, my knuckles turning white, forcing my locked knees to bear the weight of my ruined body. I stood up. The pain was not a sharp stab. It was a deep, structural ache that radiated from the marrow of my pelvic bones, threatening to buckle my legs and send me crashing to the floor. I closed my eyes, taking shallow, ragged breaths through my nose, waiting for the room to stop spinning. I looked down at myself. I was wearing a standard faded blue hospital gown, stained with iodine and sweat. I was entirely exposed in the back. I reached into the small plastic belongings bag the nurses had left on the bedside table and pulled out the oversized gray cashmere cardigan I had brought from home. Mason had bought it for me for our anniversary. The irony tasted like battery acid, but the hospital corridors were freezing and I needed the armor. I slipped it over my shoulders, the soft fabric doing nothing to warm the absolute zero radiating from the center of my chest. I moved toward the door, my right hand trailing against the sage green wall for balance. Each step was a calculated risk, a slow dragging of my feet to minimize the friction against my sutures. I reached the heavy oak door, pressed my ear against the wood, and listened. The faint rhythmic beep of distant monitors, the soft hum of an industrial floor buffer somewhere down the hall. No voices. I slowly twisted the brass handle and pulled the door open a crack. The hallway of the platinum wing was deserted. The lighting was dimmed to a soft, restorative amber. The nurse's station, located 50 yards down the corridor behind a curved mahogany desk, was occupied by a single nurse staring intensely at a computer monitor, her back angled away from my room. The neonatal intensive care unit, the NICU, was located one floor down, according to the informational packet Chloe had aggressively memorized and recited to me during the second trimester. I couldn't take the elevator. Elevators required keycard access in this wing after midnight, and they were monitored by cameras that fed directly to the private security desk in the lobby. I needed the emergency stairwell. I slipped out of the room, letting the heavy door click shut behind me. I kept my back pressed flat against the wall, moving with agonizing slowness toward the glowing red exit sign at the far end of the corridor. My bare feet made no sound on the polished linoleum, but the silence felt incredibly loud, every rustle of the hospital gown amplifying my terror. The physical exertion was rapidly draining the microscopic reserves of energy the sedative had left me. Dark spots danced in the periphery of my vision. A hot, wet sensation bloomed between my thighs, a terrifying indicator that the exertion was triggering fresh bleeding. I couldn't stop. The biological imperative overriding my central nervous system was absolute. The child was mine. He was flesh of my flesh, ripped from my core and weaponized by the two men who controlled my existence. I had to see him. I reached the heavy fire door of the stairwell, pushed down on the metal crash bar with both hands, and slipped into the concrete shaft. The temperature dropped 10 degrees in the stairwell. The air smelled of concrete dust and ozone. The harsh, unshielded fluorescent bulbs buzzed aggressively above my head. I gripped the cold steel railing, white-knuckling the metal as I began the descent. One step. Breathe. Drag the left foot down. Brace against the burning in my pelvis. Another step. It took me 10 minutes to descend a single flight of stairs. By the time I pushed open the door to the 4th floor, the cashmere cardigan was soaked with a cold, clammy sweat, and my breathing sounded like a death rattle, echoing off the concrete walls. The 4th floor was entirely different from the Platinum Recovery Wing. The carpets were standard industrial grade. The lighting was brighter, more clinical. This was the high-security medical zone. The entrance to the NICU was 30 feet away, secured by heavy double doors with frosted glass panels and a biometric scanner. I couldn't get in. I stood in the shadows near the stairwell door, my heart hammering a frantic, erratic rhythm against my ribs. I had pushed my body to the absolute brink of a catastrophic hemorrhage, only to be stopped by a piece of locked glass. Then, the frosted glass doors hissed open. A pediatric nurse in deep purple scrubs walked out, holding a stack of laminated charts. She turned left, heading toward the main supply closet down the hall. The heavy doors began their slow, pneumatic close. I didn't think. I abandoned the wall. I threw my entire weight forward, ignoring the tearing, searing agony ripping through my lower half. I practically fell toward the gap, shoving my shoulder between the heavy glass panels just before the magnetic lock engaged. The thick glass bit hard into my collarbone, but the sensor registered the obstruction, and the doors slowly slid back open. I slipped inside, instantly ducking behind a massive stainless steel linen cart parked near the entrance. The NICU was not a single room. It was a sprawling, dimly lit labyrinth of isolated pods, separated by transparent acrylic walls. The air was incredibly warm, heavily filtered, smelling faintly of sterile wipes and warm plastic. The environment was dominated by the rhythmic, overlapping symphony of specialized life support machinery, the soft hums, the gentle clicks, the occasional high-pitched chirp of a monitor registering a shift in oxygen saturation. I crept around the edge of the linen cart, keeping my head low. There were 3 nurses at the central circular desk, all deeply engaged in charting, the soft glow of the monitors illuminating their faces. I moved through the outer ring of the unit, checking the digital nameplates mounted above each isolation pod. Baby Boy Smith, Baby Girl Chen, Baby Boy Doe. I reached the far corner of the unit, a secluded, semi-private alcove designated for extreme high-profile cases. The digital display above the final, heavily monitored incubator didn't have a name. It simply read, Patient 004, Restricted Access. I stepped into the alcove. The incubator was a marvel of modern medical engineering. A clear, domed capsule bathed in a soft, synthetic blue light designed to treat mild jaundice. Inside the capsule, resting on a pristine white medical fleece, was a tiny, fragile bundle of humanity. He was wearing nothing but a microscopic diaper, his chest rising and falling in rapid, shallow breaths. The thick, dark auburn hair that had shattered an empire was clearly visible under the blue light. He was so incredibly small. The physical reality of him, lying mere inches away behind a layer of reinforced plastic, hit me with the force of a high-speed collision. My hands flew to the cold surface of the incubator. I pressed my palms flat against the plastic, leaning my forehead against the curve of the dome. This was the asset, the billion-dollar leverage, the stolen egg. But looking at the slight flutter of his eyelids, the tiny, translucent fingernails curled against his chest, none of the terrifying context mattered. The biological tether, severed violently in the delivery room, reconnected in a blinding flash of pure, feral instinct. He was mine. I didn't care about the trust fund. I didn't care about the sterling legacy. I would burn the entire city of Los Angeles to the ground to pull him out of this plastic box and run. The structural integrity of the left ventricle is flawless. Doctor. Eris was terrified. The extreme stress of your delivery would induce a murmur, but the boy is remarkably resilient. The voice didn't come from the hallway. It didn't come from the nurse's station. It came from the deep, pitch-black shadows of the alcove, directly behind the incubator's life support tower. I froze. The breath evaporated from my lungs. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, a primitive neurological warning of an apex predator in the immediate vicinity. Julian Sterling stepped out of the shadows. He had not changed out of the bespoke suit he wore in the delivery room, though he had discarded the tie. The top 2 buttons of his crisp white shirt were undone, revealing a sliver of pale skin. In the synthetic blue light of the incubator, the silver in his hair looked like spun steel. He held a small white styrofoam cup of hospital coffee in his left hand. The utter banality of the object in his grip made his presence infinitely more terrifying. He didn't look surprised to see me standing there, barefoot, bleeding, and trembling in a stolen hospital gown. He looked expectant. I assumed Mason's sedative wouldn't hold you until dawn, Julian stated, taking a slow sip from the styrofoam cup. His pale gray eyes analyzed my physical wreckage with the detached interest of an auditor reviewing a failing company's ledger. The maternal instinct is a highly unpredictable variable. Mason failed to model for it properly. He assumed the physical trauma would keep you anchored to the mattress. "Where is my husband?" I rasped, the words tearing my throat. I didn't turn around completely. I kept one hand pressed firmly against the plastic dome of the incubator, refusing to sever the physical connection to my son. Julian lowered the coffee cup. A slow, chilling smile ghosted across his aristocratic features. It was a smile completely devoid of warmth, a predatory baring of teeth. "Your husband," Julian murmured, the baritone voice dropping into a register that vibrated in my chest, "is currently occupying a windowless, soundproof interrogation room in the basement level of this hospital. He is engaged in a highly detailed, extremely uncooperative conversation with 2 special agents from the Federal Bureau of Investigation's White-Collar Crime Division." The room tilted. I gripped the edge of the incubator to keep my knees from buckling. "The FBI? Mason is a brilliant architect, Harper. I will concede that point." Julian walked slowly around the life support tower, stopping 3 feet away from me on the opposite side of the incubator. He looked down at the sleeping infant, his expression entirely unreadable. He builds beautiful, complex structures, assuming the ground beneath them is stable, but he failed to conduct a seismic survey before he attempted to build his little extortion scheme on my property. Julian raised his eyes from the baby, locking his freezing gray gaze onto mine. Did Mason truly believe I would allow a mid-level draftsman to hand me a DNA test and demand the keys to my kingdom? Julian asked, the sheer, staggering arrogance of his power bleeding into the clinical air. Did he think I wouldn't have my own private intelligence firm monitoring every single digital footprint attached to this surrogacy the moment the anonymous donor mysteriously vanished? The oxygen in the room thinned out to nothing. I stared at the billionaire, the horrifying architecture of his awareness slowly materializing in the blue light. "You knew," I breathed, my voice barely a whisper. "You knew about the egg theft. You knew it was Mason." I knew Chloe was embezzling from my secondary offshore accounts to cover up the clinic's failure, Julian corrected smoothly, turning the styrofoam cup in his hands. I knew she was terrified of the prenuptial agreement. And I knew Mason was greedy enough to exploit her terror. The exact mechanics of the biological swap using your genetic material instead of a stranger's was a delightful, unexpected plot twist. It simplified the legal geometry immensely. I stared at him, the nausea churning violently in my stomach. He hadn't been a victim in that delivery room. The cold, furious reaction to Chloe, the threat to Dr. Eris, it was a performance. A calculated, theatrical demolition of the people he had allowed to dig their own graves. "You let them do it," I choked out, the horror of his complicity paralyzing my vocal cords. "You let them violate my body. You let Dr. Eris put me under anesthesia and steal pieces of my core so you could have a biological asset on paper. I merely allowed the variables to play out without my interference," Julian replied, his tone entirely devoid of guilt. "Intervening prematurely would have alerted them to my surveillance. I needed them to complete the transaction. I needed the child born, the umbilical cord severed, and the extortion attempt vocalized. A crime must be fully executed before the trap can snap shut." He took another slow sip of the terrible coffee, as if discussing the acquisition of a minor tech startup. "Mason approached me in the VIP lounge 30 minutes ago," Julian continued, recounting the destruction of my husband with mild amusement. "He presented the forged 8B form. He presented the preliminary DNA swab he stole from the delivery room. He laid out his demands: a permanent position on the board of Vance Holdings, a $50 million silent trust, full access to the Aspen estate. It was a staggering display of amateur hubris. "What did you do?" I asked, terrified of the answer, yet unable to look away from the apex predator. I let him finish his little speech. Julian smiled. "I recorded the entire extortion attempt on a discrete audio device in my lapel. And then, I introduced him to the FBI agents waiting in the adjoining room. Agents I had briefed extensively on the international wire fraud your husband and your sister committed to pay Dr. Eris the bribe." Julian set the styrofoam cup down on the stainless steel counter beside the incubator. He reached into the inner pocket of his suit jacket and pulled out a sleek, black iPad Pro, the same tablet he had been calmly reviewing in the delivery room while my world tore apart. He tapped the screen twice and slid the tablet across the slick surface of the incubator dome toward me. "Mason was sloppy, Harper," Julian said softly. "He believed he was a master manipulator, but he left digital fingerprints all over the crime scene. He didn't want the bribe money tracing back to his architectural firm, so he routed the wire transfers through the Cayman Islands, using a dummy corporation. I looked down at the glowing screen. It was a digital rendering of a complex financial flow chart. My eyes scanned the bold, black text at the center of the web. LLC registered entity, Harper Davis Design Holdings. Primary signatory, Harper Davis. The breath rushed out of my lungs in a violent, silent gasp. "No," I whispered, shaking my head, backing away from the incubator, my bare feet slipping slightly on the linoleum. "No, I didn't sign that. I don't have offshore accounts. Mason manages the LLC paperwork for my design business. He handles the taxes. He told me it was standard incorporation documents. I am fully aware that Mason forged your digital signature to execute the transfers, Harper," Julian stated, the absolute calm of his voice contrasting the catastrophic reality of the screen. "I am aware you are entirely innocent of the financial crimes. You are a victim of your husband's sociopathy and my wife's desperation. Then why are you showing me this?" I asked, panic clawing up the back of my throat, tasting like copper and adrenaline. "If you know I didn't do it, tell the FBI." Julian leaned forward, resting his palms flat on the stainless steel counter. The blue light cast deep, skull-like shadows across his eye sockets. "Because, Harper." Julian's voice dropped into a whisper that felt heavier than a physical blow. "Doctor, Eris is currently on a private jet somewhere over international waters, having signed a sworn notarized affidavit claiming you were the primary architect of the egg theft." The room completely stopped spinning. Everything froze in a horrifying, crystal-clear stasis. "He lied," I rasped. "Of course he lied," Julian agreed smoothly. "He lied because I paid him $7 million from an untraceable account to lie, right before I arranged his rapid departure from the country. The affidavit states that you, Harper Davis, consumed by jealousy of your wealthy sister and desperate to secure a financial anchor to the Sterling Empire, manipulated your husband into providing the sperm and bribed the clinic to implant your own egg." "That makes no sense," I screamed, the sound muffled by the hum of the life support machines, terrified of waking the baby, yet unable to contain the absolute madness of the accusation. "Why would I do that? I was the surrogate. The psychology is irrelevant." "The paper trail is flawless," Julian countered, tapping a manicured fingernail against the screen of the iPad. "The FBI has the wire transfers bearing your digital signature. They have the sworn testimony of the attending physician, placing the blame squarely on your shoulders. Mason is currently trying to shift the blame to Chloe. Chloe is currently having a nervous breakdown in Santa Monica. And I am the tragic, betrayed billionaire whose wife and in-laws conspired to infect his bloodline with their own genetics." The walls of the NICU felt like they were rapidly closing in, crushing the oxygen out of the space. Julian hadn't just defeated Mason. He had engineered an airtight narrative that insulated him entirely, destroyed his enemies, and left me holding the murder weapon. "Why?" I choked out, collapsing against the side of the incubator, my legs finally refusing to hold the weight of the betrayal. I slid down the side of the plastic dome, hitting the cold linoleum floor, pulling my knees to my chest. "If you knew they were swapping the egg, if you knew it wasn't yours, why did you let me have him? Why didn't you just cancel the contract months ago?" Julian looked down at me from his towering height. He didn't look victorious. He looked incredibly, profoundly exhausted. He slowly walked around the incubator and crouched down, bringing his face level with mine. The scent of his expensive cologne mixed with the sterile hospital smell, a nauseating cocktail of power and bleach. "Because I am sterile, Harper," Julian whispered, a rare crack in the flawless armor. "The damage is irreversible. I cannot produce biological children, and the Sterling Board of Directors is ancient, conservative, and deeply obsessed with lineage. If I die without an heir, the company is carved up and sold to the highest bidder by a pack of vultures. I spent 20 years building this empire. I refuse to let it be dismantled." He looked past me, staring at the sleeping infant in the blue light. I needed an heir. It didn't matter whose genetics he carried, as long as the paperwork bore my name. Chloe was too incompetent to secure a child anonymously without drawing attention. But Mason was greedy enough to build the perfect crime, a child that looks remarkably like my side of the family, carried by the sister of my wife. It is a closed loop, the perfect, unbreakable narrative. Julian turned his gaze back to me, the brief flash of vulnerability entirely erased, replaced by the cold, calculating machine. He reached into his jacket pocket again and pulled out a thick, folded document printed on heavy legal stock. He dropped it onto the floor between us. This is a complete relinquishment of all parental, genetic, and custodial rights, Julian explained quietly. It includes an ironclad non-disclosure agreement carrying a $50 million penalty clause. I stared at the thick white paper. It looked like a death warrant. Mason is going to federal prison for extortion and wire fraud. Julian laid out the endgame with chilling precision. Chloe is being quietly excised from my life with a settlement that ensures she will never speak of this again. The only remaining variable is you. I am his mother, I whispered fiercely, the feral instinct clawing through the terror, my hand shooting out to press against the bottom of the incubator stand. You can't have him. I will go to the police. I will tell them everything. Julian didn't blink. If you refuse to sign that document, Harper, I will hand Dr. Eris's affidavit and the forged financial records directly to the FBI agents currently arresting your husband. You will be indicted for international wire fraud, medical extortion, and criminal conspiracy. You will face a mandatory minimum of 15 years in a federal penitentiary. He paused, letting the silence amplify the horror of the threat. You will give birth, and you will immediately be handcuffed to your hospital bed. The child will be placed into the custody of the Los Angeles County foster care system, pending the outcome of a trial that will drag on for years. He will grow up bouncing between group homes, an orphan of a highly publicized, deeply humiliating scandal. And you will rot in a cell. Julian leaned closer, his face inches from mine. Or, he breathed, you sign the paper. You walk out of this hospital with $5 million deposited into a clean, untraceable account in Switzerland. You vanish. The child is raised in the Sterling estate, given every educational, financial, and social advantage the world has to offer. He becomes the heir to a global empire. He never knows the truth of his conception, but he is safe. He is protected. The absolute zero of the trap paralyzed my heart. It wasn't a choice between wealth and poverty. It was a choice between sacrificing my freedom and my child to the chaotic meat grinder of the foster system, or sacrificing my soul to ensure his survival in a gilded cage built by a monster. Julian stood up, smoothing the wrinkles from his trousers. He looked down at me, a broken, bleeding woman curled on the floor of a neonatal intensive care unit. You have exactly 12 hours to make your decision, Harper, Julian said softly. The FBI completes their preliminary processing of Mason at noon. If I don't have your signature by then, the affidavit is submitted into evidence. He turned on his heel and walked out of the alcove, the pneumatic doors of the NICU hissing open to swallow his retreating silhouette, leaving me entirely alone in the synthetic blue light with the heavy, terrible document resting on the linoleum and the quiet, rhythmic breathing of the son I had to abandon to save. The heavy pneumatic hiss of the NICU doors, sealing shut behind Julian Sterling, was the loudest sound in the universe. It was the sound of a vault locking, entombing me in a future built entirely of glass and razor wire. The relinquishment document lay on the cold linoleum between my bare, blood-stained feet and the stainless steel base of the incubator. It was printed on 24-pound archival stock. I could see the watermark of Julian's elite corporate law firm embedded in the paper fiber. I stared at the black ink of the signature line. Then, something shifted in the atmosphere of the room. It wasn't the temperature. It wasn't the rhythmic, overlapping chirps of the life support monitors. The shift happened entirely within the architecture of my own skull. The tears stopped. It wasn't a gradual slowing, the way a storm slowly exhausts its rain. It was an instantaneous, violent severing of the tear ducts. The frantic, feral trembling in my hands ceased. The suffocating panic that had compressed my chest since the moment Mason cut the umbilical cord evaporated, leaving behind a cold, absolute, and terrifying vacuum. I reached down and picked up the document. The paper was heavy, weighted with the arrogance of a man who believed he held the absolute monopoly on ruthlessness. Julian thought he had shattered my reality. He thought the revelation of the forged LLC documents and Dr. Eris's perjury had broken the fragile, domestic designer he had permitted into his orbit. He thought the shock in the delivery room was the horrified realization that my body had been violated by a conspiracy between his wife and my husband. He was wrong. The shock in the delivery room, the absolute paralyzing terror that spiked my blood pressure and nearly stopped my heart, wasn't that the child belonged to Mason and me. The shock was that the child belonged to Mason at all. I didn't reach out to touch the incubator dome again. The maternal, desperate instinct had served its purpose, maintaining my cover while Julian laid out his endgame. Now, it receded, sinking beneath the freezing, calculated surface of my true nature. I pulled the oversized gray cashmere cardigan tighter around my shoulders, covering the dark, spreading stain on the back of my hospital gown. I looked at the sleeping infant in the blue light, the auburn hair, the genetic signature of the architect. You ruined it, Mason, I thought, the internal voice carrying no heat, only the dead, flat frequency of a surgeon assessing a botched amputation. You arrogant, sloppy amateur. You hijacked a masterpiece to build a shack. My mind rewound, not to the trauma of the delivery, but to the inception of the actual conspiracy. 14 months ago, I was designing the custom climate-controlled wine cellar in Julian and Chloe's Bel Air estate. Julian was in Geneva. Chloe was passed out in the master suite, heavily medicated on Xanax and Cabernet, mourning the failure of her third IVF cycle. I had needed the dimensions of the subfloor safe to ensure the structural load of the wine racks wouldn't compromise the concrete. The safe was supposed to be empty during the renovation. It wasn't. I had found Julian's private medical files, the detailed, highly confidential reports from a Swiss urologist confirming his absolute, irreversible sterility. The testosterone therapy hadn't just damaged his count, it had obliterated the production mechanism entirely. Julian Sterling was an evolutionary dead end. I didn't cry for my sister. I didn't feel a shred of pity for the billionaire, sitting on the cold concrete of their basement, holding those medical files. I felt the first spark of a brilliant, catastrophic ambition. I had spent my entire life in Chloe's shadow. I was the quiet, artistic sister who settled for the struggling architect while she secured the apex predator and the limitless black card. But Chloe was hollow. She was entirely dependent on a man who viewed her as a depreciating asset. I realized then that the Sterling Empire was a fortress with a single, microscopic structural flaw, the absolute requirement of a biological heir to satisfy the board of directors. I didn't want to design the interiors of their mansions. I wanted to own the deed to the entire estate. So, I built the trap. I planted the idea of surrogacy in Chloe's fragile mind during a Sunday brunch, wrapping it in the guise of sisterly devotion. I knew she would eagerly agree, desperate to secure her financial anchor. I knew Julian would fund it, viewing it as a necessary transaction. Dr. Aris wasn't bribed by Julian first. He was blackmailed by me. During the design consultation for Dr. Aris's Malibu beach house, I had installed a highly sophisticated, unauthorized data packet sniffer on his private home network. I compiled a heavily encrypted dossier of his offshore tax evasion and illegal prescription kickbacks. I presented it to him in his office, not as a threat, but as a negotiation. My silence, in exchange for the absolute, undocumented extraction of my own eggs during the cyst aspiration, and the subsequent fertilization using an anonymous, premium donor profile. I selected a donor with dominant blonde traits to perfectly mimic Julian's genetics. I had set up the LLC. I had forged my own digital signature using a randomized IP proxy to make it look like someone was trying to frame me, building a layer of plausible deniability into the foundation of my extortion. My plan was flawless. I would give birth to a child that was biologically mine and a stranger's, legally bound to Julian Sterling. Then, I would present Julian with the Swiss medical files and the true DNA results of the child. I would demand a 50% silent partnership in Vance Holdings to keep the Sterling name from becoming a public laughingstock and his board from usurping him. It was a perfect, closed loop of extortion, until the baby emerged with Mason's auburn hair. Mason, the opportunistic parasite, had smelled the desperation on Chloe. He had independently negotiated his own side deal, swapping the anonymous donor vial for his own sample, entirely unaware that the egg he was fertilizing wasn't an anonymous donor's, but his own wife's. We had both attempted to rob the same bank on the exact same night, entering through different vaults, and we collided in the dark. Mason's interference had ruined the clean geometry of my plan. He had introduced a wild card, his own biological claim that compromised my sole leverage over Julian. But as I stood in the NICU, holding the relinquishment document Julian believed was his ultimate victory, the variables realigned. The shock wore off. The architect had built a faulty beam, but I was the structural engineer. I knew exactly how to trigger the collapse. I turned away from the incubator. The physical agony in my pelvis was a distant, muted static, drowned out by the sheer, blinding adrenaline of the counterstrike. I walked out of the alcove, slipping past the pneumatic glass doors, leaving the blue light behind. I didn't return to the stairwell. I walked directly to the staff elevator bank at the end of the corridor. I pulled a small silver magnetic keycard from the pocket of my cashmere cardigan. I had slipped it from the lanyard of the nurse who prepped my IV in the delivery room, a subconscious act of resource gathering. I swiped the card, the light turned green, the heavy steel doors slid open. I pressed the button for sub-basement level 2, the restricted utility and security floor. The descent was smooth, silent. The polished steel doors reflected a ghost. My face was entirely drained of color, my dark hair plastered to my skull with dried sweat, the blue hospital gown stained with the violent evidence of birth. I didn't look like a mastermind. I looked like a casualty. It was the perfect camouflage. The elevator chimed. A soft, synthetic ping that echoed loudly in the cavernous, concrete expanse of the sub-basement. I stepped out into the freezing air. The hum of massive industrial generators vibrated through the soles of my bare feet. The lighting was harsh, unshielded fluorescent tubes casting stark, black shadows. I walked down the main utility corridor, following the faint, muffled sound of a voice. Julian had mentioned an interrogation room. I knew hospital blueprints. The only rooms on this level with acoustic paneling were the old psychiatric holding cells, repurposed years ago for secure equipment storage, often utilized by high-end private security firms guarding VIP patients upstairs. I found the heavy, reinforced steel door at the end of a blind hallway. It was slightly ajar, a sliver of harsh white light slicing across the concrete floor. I stopped just outside the sliver of light. I closed my eyes, regulating my breathing, dropping my heart rate to a slow, steady, reptilian crawl. I let the mask of the traumatized, broken victim slide perfectly back into place. My shoulders slumped. My lower lip began to tremble on command. I pushed the heavy steel door open. The room smelled of damp concrete, ozone, and the sharp, metallic tang of fresh blood. Mason was strapped to a heavy metal folding chair in the center of the room. His bespoke chambray shirt was torn at the collar, stained with dark crimson splatters. His head was slumped forward, a steady drip of blood falling from a severe laceration above his left eyebrow, pooling on his expensive leather boots. His breathing was a wet, ragged wheeze. Two men stood flanking the chair. They were not FBI agents. They wore unmarked tactical gear, their faces entirely blank, radiating the calm, terrifying professionalism of highly paid mercenaries. The fake federal badges they had likely used to intimidate Mason were nowhere to be seen. Julian Sterling sat on a metal stool against the far wall, his legs crossed elegantly at the knee, holding the iPad Pro. He looked entirely unstressed, a king observing the routine discipline of a rebellious serf. Julian's pale gray eyes snapped up from the screen as the door creaked. The microscopic tightening of his jaw was the only indication of his surprise. He hadn't expected me to be capable of walking, let alone finding the sub-basement. Mason slowly lifted his head, wincing violently as the movement pulled at the torn skin above his eye. He looked at me through a swollen, purple haze. "Harper," Mason rasped, the word a pathetic, broken plea. The arrogant architect who had claimed my child as a piece of real estate an hour ago was entirely shattered, reduced to begging the wife he had sold out. "Harper, they're not feds. He's crazy. He's going to kill us." Julian raised a single finger, a silent command. The mercenary on Mason's right casually backhanded my husband across the face with a heavy Kevlar-knuckled glove. The crack of the impact echoed sharply. Mason's head snapped to the side, spitting a spray of blood and saliva onto the concrete. He slumped back, groaning in pure agony. I didn't scream. I didn't rush forward to protect him. I stood perfectly still in the doorway, clutching the gray cardigan, watching the blood drip from Mason's chin. Julian observed my lack of reaction. The gray eyes narrowed slightly, processing the missing variable of female hysteria he had expected. "I underestimated your pain tolerance, Harper," Julian stated, his voice a smooth, echoing baritone in the concrete cell. "You should be in a heavily sedated sleep. Walking down here could trigger a secondary hemorrhage that would kill you before my men could get you back to the trauma bay." "I read the document," I whispered. My voice was intentionally frail, a thin, wavering thread of sound. I stepped fully into the room, letting the heavy steel door swing shut behind me, the latch catching with a loud, final clank. Julian uncrossed his legs, resting his hands on his knees. "And? Have you reached the only logical conclusion available to you?" I walked slowly toward the center of the room, stopping exactly equidistant between Mason's bloodied chair and Julian's stool. I held up the thick, white relinquishment document. My hand shook violently, a physical tremor I manufactured by hyper-focusing on the burning pain in my sutures. $5 million, I said, my voice cracking perfectly on the word million, and immunity from the FBI investigation regarding the LLC wire transfers. Julian smiled, the cold, victorious baring of teeth, the predator securing the kill. A clean slate, Harper. A new life, entirely unburdened by the grotesque ambition of your husband and your sister. You sign the paper, you walk away, and you never look back. Mason struggled against the heavy zip ties, securing his wrists to the metal chair. The plastic dug viciously into his skin. "Don't do it, Harp," Mason screamed, a frantic, desperate surge of adrenaline cutting through the pain. "Don't sign it. It's our baby. He can't keep him if we go to the press." "He can't." The mercenary stepped forward to strike him again. "Stop," I said. The command wasn't a frail whisper. It didn't waver. It left my throat with the density of depleted uranium, carrying an absolute, undeniable authority that froze the mercenary mid-strike. The air in the concrete cell instantly crystallized. Julian's smile vanished. The lines around his mouth hardened. He recognized the shift in frequency. It was the same shift he utilized in boardrooms right before he destroyed a rival CEO. I lowered my hand. The violent trembling stopped entirely. My posture straightened, the facade of the broken, cowering surrogate shedding in a fraction of a second. I looked at Mason, staring at his bloodied, swollen face. There was no pity in my chest. There was only a cold, clinical disgust. "You really thought you were the architect of this entire scenario, didn't you, Mason?" I asked, my voice echoing off the acoustic panels, entirely devoid of the synthetic warmth he was so accustomed to hearing. Mason stared at me, his hazel eyes wide, the panic momentarily overridden by absolute confusion. "Harper, what are you? You thought you were a master strategist because you bribed a fertility doctor and swapped a vial of sperm," I continued, taking a slow, agonizing step closer to his chair. "I didn't break eye contact. You looked at my body and saw an incubator. You looked at Chloe's desperation and saw a down payment on a Hollywood Hills mansion. You built your entire extortion plot on the assumption that I was exactly what you trained me to be. A quiet, compliant, oblivious little wife who just wanted to paint accent walls in Pasadena." "Harper, stop," Mason pleaded, the confusion morphing into a new, entirely unfamiliar terror. He was looking at a stranger wearing his wife's face. I turned my back on him. I looked directly at Julian Sterling. Julian hadn't moved, but the relaxed, imperial posture was gone. His spine was rigid. The iPad Pro in his lap was entirely forgotten. He was staring at me with the hyper-focused intensity of a man, realizing he had just stepped onto a landmine he thought he had already deactivated. "You paid Dr. Eris $7 million to sign an affidavit claiming I manipulated Mason into the egg theft," I said, my voice conversational, as if discussing the weather. I casually tossed the heavy relinquishment document onto the concrete floor. It landed with a soft, dismissive slap. "You drafted the FBI narrative based on the digital footprint of my design firm's LLC. You thought you had built the perfect cage. The cage is fully constructed, Harper," Julian countered, his baritone low, dangerous, an underlying current of warning vibrating through the syllables. "Your sudden shift in tone does not alter the structural reality of the evidence. You are still the primary signatory on the offshore accounts that funded the medical fraud." I laughed. It wasn't a hysterical sound. It was a dry, hollow, terrifyingly genuine laugh that bounced off the concrete walls and made the two mercenaries shift uncomfortably in their tactical boots. Oh, Julian, I sighed, wiping a speck of Mason's blood off the sleeve of my gray cardigan. You billionaire titans are all the same. You rely entirely on your wealth to buy the intelligence of others, and you assume your money makes you the smartest person in the room. You looked at the LLC and saw a clumsy frame job executed by my idiot husband. You never once considered the possibility that the frame job was a decoy. Julian's eyes narrowed into terrifying gray slits. Explain yourself. Mason didn't set up the Harper Davis Design Holdings LLC to buy a house, Julian, I said, closing the distance between us, stopping just outside the reach of the mercenaries. I set it up. I generated the randomized IP proxy. I embedded my own digital signature on the wire transfers to the Cayman Islands. And I didn't do it to pay Dr. Eris for an egg retrieval. I paused, letting the silence stretch until the tension in the room felt ready to snap the acoustic panels off the walls. I paid Dr. Eris with the encrypted files of his own offshore tax evasion that I pulled from his home network 6 months ago, I revealed, the truth slicing cleanly through the thick air. The $4 million that funneled through my LLC, that didn't go to the clinic. Julian's breath hitched. A microscopic intake of air, but in the dead silence of the cell, it was the sound of an empire cracking. Where did it go? Julian demanded, the icy facade finally fracturing. It went directly into a decentralized, heavily encrypted cryptocurrency wallet controlled by a shadow server located in a non-extradition jurisdiction, I replied smoothly. A server that is currently programmed with a dead man's switch. A switch that requires my biometric authorization every 12 hours to reset the countdown. Mason let out a choked, wet gasp from the chair behind me. He was drowning in a reality he couldn't comprehend. Julian slowly stood up from the stool. The physical intimidation of his height was completely neutralized by the catastrophic realization dawning in his eyes. He realized he wasn't dealing with a hysterical surrogate or an opportunistic architect. He was dealing with an apex predator who had been hunting him from inside his own house. You stole $4 million from my secondary accounts, Julian stated, his voice a lethal, vibrating hum. He glanced at the mercenaries, a silent calculation of violence. If that's all I did, you would simply have me killed right now and bury me in the foundation of a new high-rise, I countered, reading his micro-expression perfectly. But the $4 million was just the testing phase, a stress test of your digital security infrastructure, which frankly, for a man of your resources, was pathetically inadequate. I reached into the pocket of my hospital gown and pulled out the small silver magnetic keycard I had used for the elevator. I tossed it onto the concrete floor next to the relinquishment document. I didn't want $4 million, Julian, I whispered, stepping entirely into his personal space, forcing him to look down into the dead, cold void of my eyes. I wanted the entire Sterling Trust. I orchestrated the egg theft. I blackmailed Eris. I planned to use an anonymous donor to create an heir that was entirely mine, but legally bound to you. I was going to use the child to extort you for half of Vance Holdings, using your absolute sterility and your fear of the board as leverage. Julian stared at me, the color entirely draining from his aristocratic face. The horrifying architecture of my ambition dwarfed Mason's pathetic extortion attempt. But Mason ruined it. I spat the words, absolute venom lacing the syllables, pointing a trembling finger back at the bleeding man in the chair without looking at him. He swapped the donor sample for his own. He contaminated my masterpiece with his middle-class genetics and his sloppy, traceable crime. He gave you leverage. He gave you the DNA test you could use to burn Chloe and claim the child while discarding the actual mother. So, you came down here to confess, Julian said, his voice regaining a fraction of its arrogant baseline as he tried to re-establish control. A fascinating display of sociopathy, Harper, truly, but it changes nothing. I still have the affidavit. I still have the LLC documents. And now, I have your verbal confession. The FBI will. There is no FBI, Julian. I snapped, my voice cracking like a whip, silencing him instantly. Stop insulting my intelligence. Real federal agents don't break a suspect's orbital bone in a hospital sub-basement. These men are private fixers. You kept this in-house because bringing the federal government into your orbit right now would be corporate suicide. I leaned in closer, my lips inches from his rigid jawline. Because the shadow server holding that $4 million isn't just a bank account, Julian. It's a broadcast terminal, I whispered. watching the pupil of his left eye dilate in pure, unadulterated terror. When I bypassed your security to execute the transfers, I didn't just take money. I took the unredacted ledgers of Vance Holdings, the bribes paid to state senators for the zoning permits on the downtown high-rise, the systematic undervaluation of assets to evade federal capital gains taxes, the entire rotten structural core of your empire. The silence that followed was apocalyptic. Julian Sterling, the untouchable titan, stopped breathing entirely. The two mercenaries exchanged a rapid, uneasy glance, realizing the parameters of their contract had just catastrophically shifted. The target wasn't a hostage. The target was holding a thermal detonator. If I don't authenticate that server from my personal device within the next 45 minutes, I stated, checking the analog clock bolted to the concrete wall above Julian's head, an automated script will dump the entire encrypted package directly into the secure drop boxes of the Securities and Exchange Commission, the IRS Criminal Investigation Division, and the lead investigative reporter at the Wall Street Journal. Julian's hands slowly curled into fists at his sides. The veins in his neck strained against the collar of his white shirt. He had spent his life playing chess against grandmasters, and he had just been checkmated by a pawn he thought he had already sacrificed. "What do you want?" Julian asked. The three words were stripped of all baritone resonance. They were hollow, ragged, and entirely defeated. "I don't want $5 million, I replied, stepping back, surveying the wreckage of the two men who had tried to consume me. I looked at Mason, broken and bleeding, entirely irrelevant now, and I looked at Julian, his empire dangling over a precipice. "I want the absolute, irrevocable transfer of 51% of the voting shares of Vance Holdings into a blind trust controlled entirely by me." I dictated the terms with the chilling precision of a corporate raider. "I want full, legal, undisputed custody of the child. You will sign the birth certificate acknowledging paternity, securing his position as the sole heir to the Sterling estate, but you will permanently surrender all custodial rights to me." Julian's jaw worked frantically, chewing on the inside of his cheek, his mind desperately searching for a loophole, a back door, a flaw in the code. He found nothing. The structural integrity of my extortion was absolute. "And Mason?" Julian asked, his eyes darting to the bleeding man in the chair. "And Chloe? What is your design for the collateral damage?" I looked at my husband, the architect who had designed a prison for me, only to find himself locked in the basement. "You can have him, Julian," I said softly, the absolute zero of my heart freezing the air in the cell. "Pin the clinic bribery on him. Pin the wire fraud on him using the IP logs he so stupidly routed through our own router. Send him to federal prison for the next 20 years. Discard Chloe exactly as you planned. Let them burn in the fire they started." "I don't care." Mason let out a long, agonizing wail, a sound of total soul-crushing despair as he realized his wife was not his salvation, but his executioner. "You have 10 minutes to summon your legal team to this room and draft the transfer of the voting shares, Julian," I said, turning my back on both of them, walking slowly toward the heavy steel door. My body was screaming, the hemorrhage threatening to drag me into unconsciousness, but the sheer, blinding power of absolute victory held me upright. I placed my hand on the cold steel handle of the door, pausing for a fraction of a second without looking back. "I told you, Julian," I whispered into the concrete darkness. "I'm not the soil, I'm the earthquake." The rhythmic, nearly imperceptible hum of the radiant floor heating is the only sound that penetrates the 3-inch thick acoustic glass of the Aspen estate. Outside, a violent blizzard is systematically burying the Rocky Mountains in a suffocating layer of white, erasing the sharp edges of the peaks, blinding the world. Inside the sprawling cantilevered living room, the climate is engineered to a flawless 72 degrees. The air smells of burning cedar from the massive stone hearth and the faint, metallic tang of the high-altitude atmosphere. I stand by the floor-to-ceiling window, holding a crystal tumbler of sparkling water. The ice cubes clink softly against the rim, a fragile, hollow sound. I trace the condensation on the outside of the glass with a manicured fingernail. The cold radiates through the crystal, biting into my skin, but it is nothing compared to the deep, phantom ache that settles into the jagged ridge of scar tissue, bisecting my lower abdomen whenever the barometric pressure drops. A permanent architectural flaw etched into my foundation, a reminder of the cost of acquisition, On the vast, hand-woven Tibetan rug in the center of the room, a child is playing. He is 3 years old. He does not babble. He does not throw the frantic, unstructured tantrums common for his age. He sits with his spine perfectly straight, his small hands meticulously stacking smooth, geometric blocks of dark walnut. He is building a tower. He assesses the structural load of each piece before placing it, his hazel eyes narrowed in absolute, terrifying concentration. The firelight dances across the thick, dark auburn waves of his hair. He looks exactly like the man currently serving a 25-year sentence in the United States Penitentiary in Florence, Colorado, less than 300 miles away from this mountain. I take a slow sip of the water. The carbonation burns the back of my throat. Mason's letters stopped arriving a year ago. For the first 24 months of his incarceration, he utilized his single allotted weekly stamp to send frantic, sprawling manifestos written on cheap commissary paper. He pleaded. He bargained. He detailed the exact square footage of the cell he occupied, a twisted architectural analysis of his own cage. He begged me to tell the FBI the truth about the encrypted servers. He begged me to bring the boy to the visitor's room, just once, so he could see the legacy he believed he had engineered. I never opened a single envelope. I instructed the estate's private security detail to intercept the mail, run the paper through a commercial shredder, and use the pulverized remains as compost for the rose bushes in the solarium. The architect who once tried to leverage my womb for a Hollywood Hills mansion was now fertilizing my decorative landscaping. A heavy set of footsteps echoes against the reclaimed oak floorboards of the hallway. The gait is measured, deliberate, but lacking the predatory, silent grace it possessed 3 years ago. Julian Sterling steps into the living room. He is wearing a charcoal cashmere sweater and dark trousers. The silver in his hair has aggressively advanced, entirely consuming the icy blonde. The sharp, aristocratic angles of his face have hollowed out, the skin pulling taut over his cheekbones. He looks like a monarch who has survived a long, brutal siege, only to realize the enemy is occupying the throne room. Julian stops 10 feet away from me. He does not look at the child building the walnut tower. He keeps his gray eyes locked entirely on the floor, studying the intricate weave of the Tibetan rug. The board of directors is requesting your digital authorization on the acquisition of the real estate portfolio in Dubai, Julian states. His baritone voice is flat. The commanding resonance that used to vibrate in the air is gone, replaced by a dull, mechanical compliance. The proxy vote is scheduled for tomorrow morning at 9. I do not turn away from the window. I watch the reflection of Julian's hollowed face in the dark glass against the backdrop of the blizzard. I reviewed the prospectus the legal team sent last night. I reply, my voice a soft, steady current in the quiet room. The valuation is inflated by 12%. The structural integrity of their commercial holdings in the financial district is compromised by the new municipal zoning laws. The investment is a liability. Julian's jaw tightens, a microscopic twitch beneath his ear. It is the only physical indicator that the billionaire titan still possesses a pulse. The board considers it a strategic foothold. Julian counters, the words sounding recited, hollow. They are pushing for a unanimous consensus. If the majority shareholder blocks the acquisition without a counterproposal, they will perceive it as a lack of aggressive market expansion. I slowly turn around. The ice in my tumbler shifts. Let them perceive whatever they wish, Julian, I say softly, walking toward the heavy mahogany desk tucked into the alcove of the room. I set the glass down. Vance Holdings is not a democracy. It is a dictatorship. And I do not sign off on faulty foundations. Julian finally raises his eyes. The sheer, freezing contempt in his gray stare is absolute, but it is entirely contained behind a wall of impenetrable glass. He knows the parameters of his cage. If he attempts to circumvent my authority, if he attempts to rally the board against the blind trust I control, the dead man's switch on the shadow server activates. The SEC receives the unredacted ledgers. His freedom, his legacy, and his entire existence evaporate overnight. He is the CEO in name only, a highly compensated hostage paraded in front of the cameras to maintain the illusion of the Sterling dynasty. I will inform the legal department to draft the rejection, Julian murmurs, the defeat settling into the rigid line of his shoulders. Have them draft a counteroffer for the liquidation of their offshore assets instead, I instruct, tracing the edge of the mahogany desk. 30 cents on the dollar. When they refuse, we short their stock through the Cayman shell accounts. We don't acquire them, Julian. We dismantle them. Julian stares at me, a flicker of genuine, horrified awe breaking through the dead gray void of his eyes. He is looking at the monster he inadvertently created, the apex predator that evolved in the darkest corners of his own arrogance. He gives a single stiff nod, turning on his heel. He walks back toward the hallway, his footsteps heavy, entirely devoid of momentum. "And Julian," I call out, the syllables slicing cleanly through the cedar-scented air. He stops. He does not turn around. "Chloe's monthly maintenance stipend," I state, watching his spine lock. "Cut it by 40%. The private investigators reported she was seen attempting to contact a literary agent in New York regarding a memoir. "She is destitute, Harper," Julian says to the empty hallway, his voice a low, ragged scrape. "The settlement left her with nothing but the condo and the stipend. If you cut it by 40%, she will lose the property. Then she will learn the value of silence," I reply, the absolute zero of my tone freezing the remaining oxygen in the room. "Execute the reduction." Julian does not argue. He walks away, the sound of his defeat fading into the cavernous silence of the estate. I walk back to the center of the room. The child has finished his tower. It is a complex, staggering cantilevered structure, perfectly balanced, entirely defying gravity. He sits back on his heels, staring at his creation. I crouch down onto the rug, the fabric soft against my knees. I reach out, my fingers hovering over the auburn waves of his hair. He doesn't flinch. He doesn't seek the warmth of the contact. He simply turns his head, fixing those terrifying, calculating hazel eyes on my face. There is no innocent, unconditional warmth in his stare. There is only a quiet, absorbing intelligence. He is processing the environment. He is processing me. Mason provided the blueprint. Julian provided the capital, but I poured the concrete. I slowly lower my hand, resting my palm flat against his small, fragile chest. I feel the rapid, steady thrum of his heartbeat against my skin. It is the only true rhythm left in my world. The tether of blood and bone, forged in a delivery room built on lies, secured through absolute, undeniable ruin. "Perfect structure," I whisper to him, the words carrying the weight of $1 billion empire. He reaches out with a small hand and gently pushes my fingers away from his chest. He turns back to the tower, carefully removing a single load-bearing block from the bottom tier. The entire structure collapses, a chaotic, violent clatter of dark wood shattering the absolute silence of the room. He doesn't cry. He doesn't show frustration. He simply stares at the wreckage of what he built, a microscopic, chilling smile curving the edges of his mouth, already calculating exactly how to build it higher next time. I watch the firelight reflect in his eyes, and the cold reality settles into my marrow, permanent and unyielding. I destroyed 2 empires to ensure he would inherit the world, completely blind to the horrifying truth growing right in front of me. I didn't steal a child to save him from monsters. I stole him to build a better one.